I thought we were just having Sunday dinner. My mother's pot roast, my aunt's backhanded compliments, and the usual careful arrangement of conversation topics that avoided anything that might make anyone feel uncomfortable. I had no idea that within 2 hours I would be on my knees on that kitchen floor, my hands locked around my mother's rib cage, forcing air back into her lungs, while the family that had spent 15 years dismissing my career watched in stunned, horrified silence. They called me just a nurse, said it the way you'd say just a secretary or just a cashier, with that small, deliberate dip in the voice that hollows out a word until there's nothing left inside it. My mother said it to her friends at church. My aunt said it at holiday tables. My sister, my own sister, said it to her husband's colleagues at dinner parties, laughing softly as though my profession was an inside joke they all shared, and I simply hadn't been invited to understand. My name is Sarah Calloway. I am 34 years old, and I have been a registered nurse for 11 years. I work in the cardiac intensive care unit at St. Matthias Medical Center, where I have held the hands of men and women in the worst moments of their lives, where I have read EKG strips at 3 a.m. while the attending physician is still 20 minutes away, where I have made decisions, real, irreversible, life and death decisions, with a calmness that took me years to build and that I have never once been thanked for by anyone who shares my last name. I want to tell you about the Sunday that changed everything. But first, I need you to understand what it felt like to live inside my family's particular brand of love, the kind that wraps around you tight enough to feel like warmth, right up until you realize it's been squeezing the breath out of you all along. The house I grew up in sat on a quiet street in Fairfield, the kind of neighborhood where the lawns are always trimmed and the garage doors stay closed and everyone knows everyone else's business through a careful system of observation and polite inference. My mother, Patricia Calloway, had lived in that house for 38 years. She was a woman of tremendous social precision. She knew exactly what to say at a PTA meeting, exactly how long to hold a grieving neighbor's hand before the hug became awkward, exactly which of her friends' children she could mention in conversation, and which ones were best left unspoken. She kept a mental ledger of accomplishments, and she updated it constantly. Not out of cruelty, I think, but out of a deep, abiding terror of being seen as ordinary. My sister, Claire, had solved that terror for her. Claire was 31, 3 years younger than me, and she had married Dr. David Harrington, cardiologist, golf club member, owner of a house in Westfield with a double staircase and a wine cellar. My mother said his name the way other people say grace, with reverence, with gratitude, with a small upward tilt of the chin that suggested God had been personally involved in the arrangement. Claire had a daughter named Lily and a kitchen renovation that had been photographed for a local lifestyle magazine, and she worked part-time for a nonprofit that had something to do with literacy, which my mother described as Claire's little charity project with enormous beaming pride. And then there was me. I had an apartment in Creston, 22 minutes from the hospital, with a second-hand couch and a collection of medical reference books stacked along one wall, and a view of a parking structure that I had genuinely come to find peaceful. I worked 4 12-hour shifts a week. I had a gym bag that lived permanently by the front door, and a coffee maker I treated with the reverence other people reserve for religious objects. I had 2 close friends from nursing school, Renata, who now worked in labor and delivery, and James, who had moved to Seattle the previous year but called every Sunday evening without fail. I had a life that was full and purposeful and deeply, genuinely mine. But when I came home for family dinners, which I did faithfully every 2 or 3 weeks because despite everything, love is not a rational calculation. I stepped back into a version of myself that was always slightly smaller than the one I'd left at the door. My mother would ask how things were at the hospital, in the same tone she used to ask how things were at my high school job at the pharmacy. My Aunt Gloria, who arrived at every gathering 40 minutes late and left a trail of opinion behind her like perfume, would pat my hand and say something like, "Still at the bedside, sweetheart? Well, someone has to be." And my sister, who knew better, who had grown up beside me, who had borrowed my biology notes for her pre-med prerequisites before she switched to communications. Claire would simply smile at whatever her husband said next, and the moment would pass, and I would pour myself more wine and wonder why I kept coming back. The answer, I knew, was my mother, because underneath all of it, underneath the social arithmetic and the careful comparisons and the way she'd introduced me to her book club friends last spring as my daughter Sarah, who works in healthcare, underneath all of that, she was still the woman who had sat beside my bed when I had pneumonia at age 8 and read me the same chapter of Charlotte's Web 4 times because I kept falling asleep before the ending. She was still the woman who had driven 4 hours in a snowstorm to help me move into my first apartment, who had sent me a card every year on the anniversary of my nursing board exam with a handwritten note that said she was proud of me. Though she'd never quite managed to say it out loud, and definitely not in front of anyone. I kept coming back because I believed, in some room of myself I hadn't finished renovating, that one day she would say it, that one day she would look at what I did and actually see it. I had no idea it would take a piece of pot roast to make that happen. The Sunday in question was the 3rd weekend of October. I remember the date because I had traded a shift with a colleague to attend, something I rarely did, and always regretted in the planning but rarely in the actual doing. The drive to Fairfield took 40 minutes, and I spent the first 20 of them on the phone with Renata, who was 8 months pregnant and furious about her ankles, and the last 20 in the particular kind of silence that comes when you're preparing yourself for something you can't quite name, but know is coming. My mother had called the week before to let me know that Gloria would be there. And she's bringing Richard, so please be on your best behavior. He's just gotten that promotion. Richard was Gloria's second husband, a man of impressive mustache and diminishing conversational range, who worked in insurance and spoke about it constantly. There would also be Claire and David, and Lily, who was 6, and had recently discovered the word actually and deployed it with devastating frequency. My mother had also mentioned, with the careful nonchalance that meant she had rehearsed it, that she'd run into a man named Tom Ellison at the club, widower, early 40s, architect, and had happened to mention I would be at dinner. I almost didn't go. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the story. I almost called and said I was picking up an extra shift, which I could have arranged, which no one would have questioned, which would have been the easiest lie I'd told in years. But I didn't. I went. Because I always went. Because the alternative felt like a kind of surrender I wasn't ready to make. The house smelled the way it always smelled in October. Dried herbs from the garden, the faint wood smoke of the first fire of the season, something sweet and caramelized from the oven. My mother met me at the door in her good blouse, the navy one with the pearl buttons, and she kissed my cheek and said I looked tired, which was her version of hello. The kitchen was warm and cluttered with activity. Lily was drawing at the table. Gloria was opening wine with the authority of someone who owns the corkscrew. Richard was describing a claims dispute to David, who was nodding with the practiced patience of a man accustomed to performing attention. Claire hugged me. She always hugged me. She was genuinely warm, my sister, which made everything harder rather than easier. "You cut your hair," she said, pulling back to look at me. I hadn't. I touched the end of my ponytail and said nothing. Tom Ellison arrived 20 minutes later. He was pleasant-looking in a nondescript way, with the kind of firm handshake that men who attended the right schools believe compensates for a lack of conversational flexibility. My mother introduced me as my daughter, Sarah, who was in nursing. Not a nurse in nursing, as though it were a phase I was passing through. And Tom nodded and said, "That must be rewarding," in a tone that suggested he had already decided to talk to David about something more interesting at the first opportunity. Dinner was served at 6:30. The pot roast was exceptional. My mother was a genuinely gifted cook, and this was never in dispute. There was roasted garlic bread and a green bean salad with shallots, and a bottle of Bordeaux that Richard announced cost more than he let on. The conversation moved in its usual orbits. David mentioned a conference in Chicago. Claire described Lily's new school program. Gloria opined about a neighbor's landscaping choices. Tom Ellison held court briefly about a commercial project he was designing in Hartford. My mother asked him thoughtful questions and laughed at the right moments and cut her eyes toward me twice in a way that I recognized as hope. I ate my pot roast. I listened. I said the things that are required of you at family tables. Yes, it's delicious. Yes, Lily has really grown. Yes, Hartford is lovely in fall. And then Gloria, reaching for the breadbasket and gesturing broadly to make a point about something I had already stopped following, said it. Said it right across the table to Tom, as though I weren't sitting 4 feet away. It's such a shame Sarah never went back to get her medical degree. She had the grades for it, you know. But she got into nursing and then just stayed. She said stayed the way you say settled. She picked up her bread. Still, someone has to do it. The table did not go quiet. That was the worst part. The table did not go quiet because no one thought it required silence. David turned back to his wine. Claire looked at her plate. My mother reached over and touched Tom's arm to redirect the conversation toward the Chicago conference. Richard said, "Absolutely, absolutely," for reasons unrelated to anything that had just been said. I set down my fork. I looked at my hands for a moment. The hands that had, 3 days earlier, assisted in the cardioversion of a 57-year-old man whose heart had gone into atrial fibrillation at 2 p.m. The hands that had started a central line on a patient whose veins had collapsed from years of chemotherapy. The hands that shook, slightly, not from emotion but from the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding things together for other people for 11 years and has never once been asked how they're managing. I picked my fork back up. I said nothing. I had been saying nothing for so long that the silence had its own shape, its own weight, its own texture, unsmooth and dense, like the handle of a surgical instrument worn down by use. What I didn't know was that the evening wasn't finished with me yet, not even close. Because 4 minutes later, my mother reached for a second piece of pot roast, and the piece of pot roast reached back. It happened without warning, the way the worst things always do. One moment my mother was laughing at something Tom had said, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she rarely allowed herself in company. And the next moment the laugh stopped, not tapered off, stopped, like a power cut. Her hand went to her throat, and the color that had been in her cheeks from the Bordeaux in the warm kitchen drained away so fast it was as though someone had pulled a plug somewhere behind her eyes. She made a sound, not a cough, not a gasp, something between the two, something that was more absence than noise. And her fork hit the edge of her plate with a sharp, bright clatter that finally made the table go quiet. Everyone looked. No one moved. I was already standing. I don't remember deciding to stand. I don't remember pushing back my chair or dropping my napkin or moving around the end of the table. What I remember is the sudden clarity. The way the world contracted to a single point of focus, the way every extraneous thing fell away, the wine and the bread, and Tom Ellison's careful tie and Gloria's open mouth, all of it dissolving into irrelevance. And what remained was my mother's face and the particular gray-blue that was beginning to replace the pink of her cheeks and the absolute cellular certainty of what I needed to do next. "She's choking," I said. I wasn't speaking to anyone specifically. I was simply narrating what was true, the way I narrate assessments to myself in the ICU at 2 a.m. when I'm the only one in the room. Everyone moved back. David started to rise. He was a cardiologist, a good one, by all accounts. But he had not performed emergency airway management since his residency, and I watched him register this fact in real time, watched his body begin the calculation of competence versus proximity, and I was already past him before he'd finished the equation. I got behind my mother. She was half out of her chair, one hand still at her throat, the other gripping the tablecloth with a force that sent the salt shaker tipping sideways. I could feel the tension in her body, the rigid, desperate architecture of a person fighting for air, and I wrapped my arms around her from behind, found the landmark I needed without thinking about finding it, 2 fingers above the navel and below the sternum, clasped my hands together and delivered the first thrust. Nothing. "Mom." My voice was even. I had trained it to be even. I had practiced that evenness for years in rooms where people were afraid, because evenness is contagious and panic is contagious, and in that moment I needed one of those things to spread across my mother's dining room, and I knew which one I was choosing. "I've got you. Stay with me." Second thrust. She coughed. A real cough this time, violent and productive. And the obstruction cleared, and she pulled in air with a sound like a door thrown open in a windstorm, ragged and enormous, and the most beautiful sound I had heard in years. I kept my arms around her. I held her while she breathed. I counted her breaths without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, 4. The way I count everything, the way counting is the architecture that holds me upright in a crisis. Her hands found my forearms and gripped them, and I felt her fingers, cold, shaking, surprisingly small. And I thought of the card she'd sent me every year, the handwritten note, the 4-hour drive in the snowstorm. "You're okay," I said. "You're okay. Nice slow breath." The dining room was absolutely silent. I mean that, in a way, I had never experienced that room before. Every Sunday dinner I had attended in my adult life had some layer of ambient noise. The clink of silverware, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, someone's chair scraping, Richard's voice filling available space with insurance anecdotes. But in that moment, there was nothing. There was only the sound of my mother breathing and the sound of my own heartbeat, loud and slow and steady, the way it always goes in emergencies, slower, not faster, as though my body has learned that speed is not the same as precision. I helped my mother back into her chair. I crouched beside her so we were at eye level. Her mascara had tracked a thin, dark line down one cheek. Her good navy blouse was askew at the collar. She was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not the careful social warmth of public Patricia, not the slightly distracted efficiency of home Patricia, not even the tender late-night Patricia who existed in my memory of childhood. She was looking at me the way you look at something you've had in your house for years without ever actually seeing. And then one day, the light shifts, and you realize what it is. "Sarah," she said. Her voice was rough. "Sarah, Don't try to talk yet," I said. "Small sips of water. I need to check your pulse." I took her wrist between my fingers. Her heart rate was elevated but regular. Color was returning. The gray-blue was gone. Good. That's good. Just breathe. I was aware, distantly, of the rest of the table. Of Lily, who had climbed into David's lap and was very still in the way children go, still when they understand that something important has happened, even if they don't understand what. Of Gloria, who was sitting with both hands pressed flat on the tablecloth as though she needed it to be solid. Of Tom Ellison, who had pushed his chair back and was standing against the wall with the expression of a man who has attended an event substantially different from the one he had anticipated. Of Claire, who was crying, quietly, with her hand over her mouth, the way she'd cried at our grandmother's funeral, contained, private, as though she was apologizing for the tears even as she produced them. And of David, who was watching me with something I had not expected to see on my brother-in-law's face, the man who had, at last year's Easter dinner, suggested to my mother that I might consider moving into a more clinical leadership role, as though bedside nursing was a waypoint rather than a destination. David was watching me with something that looked unmistakably like respect. I sat back on my heels. My mother's pulse was normalizing under my fingers. The crisis was over. It was, by any clinical measure, a routine intervention. I had performed it before, or variations of it. I had managed airway obstructions. I had run codes. I had held things together in rooms where the stakes were absolute and the margin for error was zero. What happened at my mother's dining table was not the most technically demanding thing I had done that week. It was not even close, but it was the first time my family had seen me do it. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. Lily broke the silence, the way children reliably do, by asking in a clear, earnest voice, "Is Grammy going to be okay?" And David said yes, she was going to be completely fine. Aunt Sarah had helped her, and Lily looked at me, this 6-year-old girl who had spent dinner asking to be excused so she could look at something on her tablet, and said, with the particular gravity children bring to moments they sense are important, "Aunt Sarah saved her." "She did," David said quietly. I stood up. My knees ached. I was still in my dress from the drive, not my work clothes, and the floor was hardwood, and I was 34, and my body was beginning to register the small insults of crouching on hard surfaces with less diplomatic silence than it had at 24. I straightened my dress. I picked up my napkin from where it had fallen beside my chair and put it on the table. Gloria said my name. I turned to look at her. She was, and I want to be precise about this because Gloria's face was not a face accustomed to uncertainty. She was at a loss. Gloria, who had an opinion on every surface and a comment for every silence, was sitting with her mouth slightly open and nothing coming out of it, and she looked for the first time in my memory like someone who understood that she'd been wrong about something for a long time and didn't yet know how to carry that. "Gloria," I said. My voice was even, not cold. I wasn't performing anything in that moment. I was too tired for performance. Just even, the same evenness I bring to rooms where people are afraid. I'm a registered nurse with 11 years of cardiac ICU experience. I'm not just anything. I didn't say it loudly. I didn't need to. The room was still quiet enough that every word landed cleanly, without echo, without distortion. She closed her mouth. She nodded once, slowly. My mother was watching me. She had both hands in her lap, and she was watching me with that same shifted, light expression. And I saw her open her mouth and then close it, and I thought, for one resigned moment, that she was going to say something careful and measured and socially calibrated, something that would tuck the moment away into the drawer where she kept the things that were too large for the room. Instead, she said, "I never told them what you actually do." Her voice was still rough from the coughing. The words came out without preamble, without softening, the way things come out when your body has just reminded you sharply of its own fragility. At church, at the club. I say you work in healthcare. I say you're in nursing. I never say. She stopped. Her jaw tightened. I was embarrassed. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense to me now. She looked at her hands. You could have just let me choke. I couldn't have, I said. That's rather the point. Claire made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and pressed her hand harder against her mouth. What came after was not a dramatic reckoning. There were no raised voices, no confessions extracted under pressure, no ultimatums delivered across the ruins of the pot roast. Life is rarely that clean, and I had stopped expecting clean from this family several years earlier. What came after was something quieter, and I think more lasting. My mother, after everyone else had shifted back into the careful motion of a dinner party finding its footing again, reached across the table and took my hand. She didn't say she was proud of me. Not yet. That came later, in stages, over months. First in a phone call, then in person, then eventually, surprisingly, in front of her book club, where I heard secondhand from Renata's mother that Patricia Calloway had described her daughter as a cardiac ICU nurse, one of the best in her unit, actually. But that night she took my hand, and she held it, and that was enough. Not everything, not all that had been lost or diminished or spoken carelessly over the years, but enough to begin with. Tom Ellison left shortly after dessert. David walked me to my car. He stood at the end of my mother's driveway with his hands in his pockets and the October air moving cold around us, and said quietly that he owed me an apology. "I've been condescending," he said. I didn't think I was being condescending, but that's usually how it works. I told him I appreciated him saying it. I meant it. I drove home with the windows down. The night was sharp and clear, the kind of fall night that smells like wood smoke and cold grass and the faint mineral edge of things going dormant, saving themselves for spring. I thought about the feel of my mother's pulse under my fingers, elevated, then steadying, then steady, then mine to release. I thought about 11 years of bedside work, of the hands I had held and the monitors I had read and the decisions I had made in the 30 seconds before anyone else had finished deciding whether to panic. I thought about Lily's voice. Aunt Sarah saved her. 3 months later, I was asked to lead a training workshop for new ICU nurses at St. Matthias. I accepted without hesitation. My mother sent a card when I told her, a real one, paper, with a stamp. And inside she'd written 4 words, "I am so proud." She still sometimes says, "in nursing," instead of "a nurse." Old habits are geological. They shift in inches, not overnight. But she says it less, and when she catches herself, she corrects it. That's not nothing. In my experience, that's almost everything. I kept the card. I put it on the shelf above my medical reference books, between the parking structure view and the coffee maker I treat like a religious object. Some mornings, I look at it before I leave for the hospital. Not because I need the validation. I stopped needing the validation somewhere in year 7, in a room at 2 a.m, when I held a situation together with precision and calmness, and no one but me and the patient ever knew. But because it reminds me of something I want to stay true, that being seen by the people you love is not the same thing as knowing your worth, but it is not nothing either. I am 34 years old. I am a cardiac ICU nurse with 11 years of experience. I am not just anything, and I never was.